Or you can just go.
Yeah. Perfect. Thank you, everybody, for being here, for attending this important conference. I'm going to have to leave immediately after my presentation because I have a flight to catch, but I'm able to answer questions via email anyways afterwards. So structural changes to avoiding extractivism in grant writing. I'm going to start by saying that I have a few initial considerations. First of all, I do not represent the voices of indigenous people, so I want to be clear about that. I respect that, and I just represent here my own voice as a grant writer. But also the University of Denver and the greater city of Denver reside within traditional territories, Hinoneno, Tsitista, and Nutsi. And obviously, it continues to be indigenous territory as of now as well. We know as Colorado, but it's important to make those clarifications. I think, and this is an essay that is going on, so I'm also looking for feedback on my approach, but when approaching the topic of indigenous responses to climate change, I think we should all, as academics, step a little bit back and assess how we are approaching the issue, the scope, the ways we capture knowledge on the topic, and the processes involved in studying the matter, as well as the next steps that follow once we reach some type of agreement in the science, in the Western science. I think a collective we needs to assess benefits for the communities and stakeholders involved, avoiding extractivism, of course, that usually brings just unilateral benefits to some. My experience has been that of, going to communities, particularly in Guatemala, spending time with them, unpaid time with them, getting back, writing your paper, and then forget about these communities, or even not taking the time to translate the results of your own research that has been performed there. Set aside defining the questions for the whole research and assessing the relevance for those communities. So I think we need to be very critical about this, and this is my intention here. Obviously, inside of current world challenges, climate change, hunger, access to water, which somehow are all related to, there's a growing recognition, obviously, of the need for a more integrated approach, problem solving via science, and other forms of knowledge that has started to emerge. And why am I saying started to emerge? Because of the urgency of climate change is what I'm trying to pose here, right? So there's obviously what brings us here on indigenous responses to climate change is exactly that need for a more integrated approach. So given the urgency that we're facing as a world, as Earth, the new approach, in my perspective, obviously needs to be realistically inclusive. By that I mean not only on paper, but also acknowledging the limitations that we have to reach inclusiveness, right? Because also creating fake expectations in those communities is equally as bad as overpromising. So let's just be very realistic when we talk about inclusiveness, especially when we are talking about inclusiveness from a US-centric approach. And I'm going to get to that in a second. It has to be substantially funded, and it needs to be problem-solving oriented. Again, due to the urgency of all these challenges. Now, in my essay, I'm taking two different perspectives or approaches to critically assess these current structures in place. And by structures, I mean set of finance rules, mostly, and administrative procedures that are currently on some of the funding agencies. I'm taking the one from NSF because that's the one I'm closest with. And so I'm taking two approaches. One, obviously, critically assessing this document. It's a consensus document put forth by the National Science Foundation, by the National Academy of Science, on what is it going to be that we're going to deliver in this new generation of Earth system science. How does that look according to the National Science Academy of the US, and therefore, adopted by the National Science Foundation? By the way, the National Science Foundation funds about 25% of research going on in universities and academia in the US. And then obviously the second approach that I'm taking here, and they're interconnected, is mine as a writer, as a grant writer, trying to get funding. I'm specifically addressing dynamics of integrated socio-environmental systems, the DICES award that I have been applying for and granted, because I know it deeply, but also because it's the one that connects environment with socio-economic systems. So I'm decomposing here a little bit of what is in the document. please take a look at this document. The citation is right there, it's online. And it has 6 approaches that they considered as what should be included in a more inclusive approach, integrated approach to our system science. So the first one, it says, advance both curiosity-driven and use-inspired basic research on Earth systems across spatial, temporal, and social organization scales. So I'm going to be presenting each of the 6. That's what my presentation is going to revolve around. But then I challenge that with my own experience as a grant writer, all right? So use inspire there in this document is defined as research that seeks a fundamental understanding of scientific problems while at the same time having a clear and direct use for society. And the conversation after mine is going to be centered around this. So I really encourage you to try to connect these two. But this is something that we're aiming at, and it's not new. It's in the document. The document is of 2022. But I think we're struggling to get there. How do we get a clear and direct use for society, right? And again, my caveat here is, how do we do so from a US-centric perspective? That is claiming not to be, that is claiming that this approach should be more international, more engaging with stakeholders. But the moment you move from chapter 1 to chapter 2 in this document, it becomes US-centric again, all right? So that's my critique in this process. So challenge 1, how do we, and I quote it here for obvious reasons, how do we make sure that there is a clear and direct use for society? That we should not be us sitting in this room as academics, that we should include the communities we're aiming to work at, especially distant ones, right? If the results of science funded here result in papers published in English and stored in distant libraries, and distant, I mean both physically distant, but language distant and, interpretation distant, how do we start to solve this? More so, how can appropriation be avoided? Next topic on the next conference. Step 2 of this approach to science: facilitate convergence of social, natural, computational, and engineering sciences to advance science and inform solutions to Earth systems-related problems. Inform solutions. First, who defines a problem? When you define the problem, you define the solution by definition. If the problem is lack of water, the solution is water. So, who is defining this problems? How much of what could be brought by these social, natural, computational, engineering sciences remains unilateral / extractive at best, and exclusive and misrepresented at worst in the context of indigenous knowledge? How and where am I headed to this in my own experience? How do I connect to this? Computational engineering sciences are doing baby steps in some of developing countries like Guatemala, like my own country. There's an imbalance of power. There's power asymmetries there that need to be addressed before we just concern about how do we bring them together. We need to understand this. On the other hand, and this connects to a follow-up challenge number 5, but I'm going to get ahead of myself here. Modeling and computing, right, and observations of science elsewhere are not as dense, are not as consistent as they are in the US and I hate to use this term, but the northern world, right? I hate to use it, so I'm struggling to use it, but it's not I'm gonna get ahead of myself again. But how can this bringing of natural computational engineering with those asymmetries inform solutions to our systems related problems? And more so, what perspective is used to define our systems related problems? Again, if you define the problem, you define the solution. So we need to understand this very deeply as we go into grant writing. So an integrated approach, according to them, should also ensure diverse, inclusive, equitable, and just approaches to Earth system science. This is a quote from who participates in defining and studying the Earth science influences how well I understand these systems, right? So they're acknowledging this, and I'm glad to see this in the document. But the challenge, I guess, is how do we translate this into actions? Which point of the research process are these stakeholders usually involved in participating? And this is a question for all of us. And at what point should they be? They say it should be done from the beginning. The beginning starts way before the funding. The beginning starts way before even approaching NSF or funding agencies. how do we get, and here's one of the biggest probably structural changes that I would like to see. How do we acknowledge that when we approach these communities, trust is one of the things that creates engagement? That is not gained in the 4 or 5 years of an NSF grant. It needs to be built beforehand. And usually the costs associated with that are bear by universities or by people like us, right? We have communities that we've been working with that trust us, but that's earned, that's time, that's respect spent in these communities, right? And it's not necessarily recognized by funding agencies as of now. And it's a challenge. And guess what? It has huge implications for the success of our own research, for the success of the expected results, and more so for the impacts that this research is aiming to have. So this is one of my biggest calls, having written and being granted one of these NSF grants. This needs to be put into perspective. If the process aims at being diverse, inclusive, equitable, and just, then the timelines and processes need to be reviewed. Power asymmetry still exists in those with the financial capability to invest in even formulating the research questions versus those currently considered the subject of study. So we need to be very critical about this, recognize this, and involve the communities in formulating the research questions, especially because now we're aiming at studies that are use-centered, that need to be pragmatic, that need to solve issues, right? So we need to involve the communities from the beginning, and not the beginning of NSF, the beginning of the research process, the beginning of the questioning of how do we solve this project together. More so, how do we remove some structural barriers that impede the others to be co-PIs and consider them equal in the development of research questions? Do they deserve to be paid? Of course they deserve to be paid. I have seen enough of research that goes, extracts, right? Not even consider the, as we call it, the journal, the time of these people answering our long surveys of 2.5 hours, while they should be taking care of their crops, for instance, right? So it's past that. That should be obvious. But it's like, let's consider these other forms of knowledge equally important, right? Their time equally important. Guess what? You gain so much more engagement, as we all do. Get paid to do stuff. Stop the free stuff. Challenge number 4, or the approach that they suggest: prioritize engagement and partnership with diverse stakeholders to benefit society and address Earth systems-related problems at community, state, national, and international scale. So my emphasis here is in the international scales. Many modes of engagement are out there. We've read many, I guess, defining literature, but how many have they considered the perspective of others in building this approach? How has research been prioritized versus other community needs usually not satisfied? How do we usually parachute into communities saying, oh, let's talk about gender now, when we know they're actually struggling to feed their families? We usually prioritize these agendas, right? We prioritize these agendas. Have we asked what is the priority in that community before starting to develop this other relevant questions? And here's something that is that I discovered in my own thinking. I guess maybe some of you are already in that aspect, but the loss and damage narrative is out there now. It's about to be funded in the COP28. Hopefully the mechanisms will be laid out, but there is a hidden loss opportunity in all these communities, indigenous communities, currently dealing with the urgency of climate change, because as we know, they're very vulnerable to climate changes. What would have they done or prioritized if they didn't have to focus on imposed crisis? What institutionality has been lost? What governance has been lost? What other development has been lost in those communities? Because now they have to focus on surviving, not because of their own CO2 putting out there, right? It's an imposed crisis that obviously needs an emergent addressing. But there's loss in institutionalization. There's loss in recovering from failed states, from foreign invasions. That is all put aside and put under the rug of climate change and needs to be addressed. How do national urgency to fill in the knowledge gaps? This is a quote from the document. There's a national urgency to fill in the knowledge gaps. How can we pair that with a slow pace of trust building in distant communities just recently acknowledged by these NGCs? So there's a line there that we have to balance. Yeah, it's urgent, but we cannot just go over because of the urgency of it. We need to respect that. Number 5, use observational, computational, modeling capabilities synergistically to accelerate discovery and convergence. This is my favorite for ease because it's self-explanatory. These are exclusive by definition. Observations in the world are not even. Monitoring of the climate system is not even, and it has such big impacts. Look at the regions where you have the least weather stations. The Amazon in an entire, I mean, most of Central America, the ocean, right? And here we are drawing very prescribed conclusions about drought and migration. Oh, there's a drought and migrate. It's so much more than that. It's so much not monitored, right? And if I zoom in Guatemala's region, for instance, most of the corn planted areas have one weather station around 200 kilometers. But here we are drawing conclusions about how corn availability and migration are related. Let's be very careful and accept that this is a reality. And it's not, you know, we're currently doing another NSF grant, a HEX one, trying to assess the difference between what people refer on the ground, drought, versus what we see from space, right? From chirps, from satellite imageries, from gridded data sets. Guess what? They don't match. And how do you validate that? You have to ground truth it with data from weather stations. So it matters. It matters that we understand these asymmetries. And of course, if we go farther into modeling, who's doing current modeling in the world? Look, is the global north, right? Again, my favorite paragraph there. Is the global north. Does it matter? It matters 100%. I'm a climatologist. I work on this. Guess what? Most of the Canadian and US made from NASA systems don't necessarily relate well to the historic climatic conditions of Guatemala. They are really good for the US, but they are not good for Guatemala. And here we are trying to build forecasts, right, to help people adapt that have limited certainties because of this lack of monitoring and lack of weather stations. I'm going to go real quick and real deep here into Guatemala, but many of these weather stations had a gap, and you can see it in the record during the Civil War. So those invasions of Guatemala had so much more far consequences that we can think of. People was killed going to get the data because back then you manually downloaded the data. And I know the people reporting this, they were killed. And now we have a lack of information that cannot help us understand satellite versus land use climatology. So colonialism is still present here in this uneven measurement of systems, and we have to acknowledge it. So when we are thinking that we can just put them all together, and we have to acknowledge the asymmetries, cannot move forward without filling these gaps, structural gaps. This is also what I meant by structural changes. And the number 6, and this is the last one, educate and support a workforce with the skills and knowledge to effectively identify, conduct, and communicate Earth system science. And this is, at times the easiest to grasp, I think. But for me, it was the most challenging one. How can we achieve a diverse workforce that is transdisciplinary and remains so, aka not affected by political changes, funded, that is also protected against political changes where, I'm not going to go into that, but and that extends beyond the US-centric approach that actually addresses Earth system issues. Can we do that? And that's a challenge. Can we all do this? How do we get there? This is the basic of my essay. I'm going to accept questions because I'm not going to be part of the discussion, but happy to answer questions and discuss. And if you have any input, suggestions, new approach to this, I really encourage you to read this document. And let's try to transform how we do science. Let's be more inclusive by doing it ourselves. And so thank you for the space.